Good morning, everyone. Most welcome to this webinar on the diplomatic relations between China and the Nordic states that the Stockholm China Center at ISDP organizes in collaboration with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. My name is Julian and I'm the head of the Stockholm China Center. In particular, I wish to welcome Mrs. Gabriele Baumann, the director of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung's office in Stockholm. On behalf of the ISDP, I would like to take this opportunity to express our gratitude to the Adenauer Stiftung for the financial support that we have received. Without this support, it would not have been possible to produce our report on Chinese-Nordic relations. I would also like to say a special welcome to Mr. David Merkle from the Adenauer Stiftung, who joins us today from Berlin, I think, and to Mr. Viking from the Swedish National China Center. These two gentlemen have both graciously accepted to take part as discussants today. Mr. Merkle and Mr. Boman are both accomplished China specialists. Today's webinar is the first in a series of 3 webinars on Chinese-Nordic relations that we will organize this autumn. At these webinars, we will discuss the extensive report by my colleague Julian, who wrote his report in collaboration with some of our colleagues, especially Mr. Johannes Nordin, Ms. Charlotte Poirier, and Ms. Viola Pulkkinen. I hope you have all received at least the first 2 major sections of this report, and the rest will hopefully be finalized and distributed later during this week. Today's webinar will focus especially on the evolution of diplomatic relations between China and the Nordic countries and on the present state of our relations, while the next 2 webinars will be devoted to economic relations and people-to-people relations, as well as to Chinese interests in the Arctic, respectively. And now, before we proceed, I would like to invite Mrs. Gabriele Baumann to say a few words. Please, Gabriele.
Thank you so much, Torbjörn. And I would also like to welcome everyone on behalf of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, Stockholm, our office for the Nordic countries. And I would also like to express my gratitude to the Institute for Security and Development Policy and the Stockholm China Center. And of course, I would like to thank Torbjörn Luden and Julian for the study they have done in a very short time, actually, but on a very, very good ground. So thank you so much, and I'm really happy that it could, especially now, these 2 parts could be made available to the audience. Konrad Adenauer Stiftung has more than 120 offices all over the world. And we have, when it comes to Asia, we have offices in Beijing, in Shanghai, and also in Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, we have an office with focus on climate and energy. So KAS stands for International Dialogue and Academic Reflection. And therefore, I'm really, again, thankful that we have the possibility today to introduce this report on China-Nordic relations, which you have partly received as a draft, as it was said. And the ideas of the discussion today during the webinar also have a chance to be.
Ms. Baumann, I think you are muted.
I'm sorry, yes. As I wanted to say, the result of the discussion, the ideas of this discussion today would also have a chance to be considered in the final publication, which will be published, we hope, by the beginning of the next week. So it was said what we will focus on this first seminar, webinar, and also the second and the third one, which we are going to conduct until the end of this year. So many global questions and challenges are nowadays centered around China, like climate change, sustainability, global health, and digital connectivity. China has been high on Germany's agenda, at least for the last decade. China is Germany's main trading partner, but we also realized lately during the pandemic that Germany has to become more independent on imports from China. There are so many more topics, and I'm really glad that David Merkle from our headquarters, my colleague, so to say, is a desk officer for China, is with us today and can share his views also on the relations between Germany and China. Because as I said, there are so many other topics. There's a strong concern about Beijing's military agenda in the Arctic, as one example, and many political actors demand a stronger voice when it comes to human rights issues. And I think it's very interesting when we focus on the study, which Torbjörn Luden and Julian Tucker have elaborated on. So it's interesting to see how the Nordics, the different countries work with China, because there is, so I understand there are different approaches among the 5 Nordic countries, and I'm really curious to hear more about that. But yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks again for the study, for the publication, and thanks for having this discussion and for taking part in this today. Yeah, thank you. And I will hand over to Torbjörn again.
Thank you very much, Gabriele, for your kind words. And let me again say that it's so very nice for us to have this opportunity to cooperate with the Adenauer Stiftung. Germany and Sweden have so much in common, and at least from a Swedish perspective, it is my conviction. I'm very much convinced that we have a lot to gain from learning from Germany when in various areas, not least when it comes to our relations with China. And also, I think we have a lot to gain from coordinating even more than so far our relationships with China. So now let us proceed. We will first ask Julian Tucker to introduce the ISDP's report, and this will take approximately 15 to 20 minutes. After this, David Merkle and Viking Boman will speak for roughly 10 minutes each, discussing the report or other issues that come to mind. Finally, we will have some time for discussion, and we welcome the members of the audience. I think there are around 50 people attending this event, which is very good. We encourage the members of the audience to press the Q&A button on your screens and write down your questions and comments that I hopefully will have time then towards the end of this webinar to read and raise. Now, Julian Tucker. Julian is a research fellow and research coordinator at the Stockholm China Center at ISDP. He holds a Master of Arts in Central Asian Studies at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Julian is American, but he is almost German, at least fluent in the German language. Additionally, he has pursued Uzbek language and history courses at the Samarkand State Institute of Foreign Languages in Uzbekistan. He holds a BA degree in anthropology and Middle Eastern languages from McGill University in Montreal. So this means that Julian is for his age, a very erudite young scholar. Julian, the floor is yours.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you, Torbjörn and Gabriele, for that introduction. I should say off the bat, in the spirit of transparency, I am a US citizen as well as a German citizen. So I have a complicated mixed identity. But I feel that helps a lot when we talk about things as complicated as diplomatic history. Certainly, you can't just take one approach, or it's very difficult to sort of box things as complicated as the relations between countries, let alone between people, into sort of an easy report or sort of an easy framework. But it's great to be here with all of you, and it's great that we have so many attendees. And I hope as many of you as possible have had a chance to read a little bit of our advanced drafts. Don't worry, there isn't going to be a test or anything like that. I'll kind of try to walk us through some of these parts. But I should say at the very beginning that in writing this report, we sort of set a task for ourselves that it be general and readable. So the report doesn't make any pretense to be exhaustive. There is a lot to be said about Sino-Nordic relations, both in terms of its history and its current configuration and its future trajectory. These things are very important to talk about, and it can be very difficult to tease things apart. And as most people who work at ISDP, particularly people who have done internships at ISDP can tell you, I have a tendency to be very verbose and to get caught up in details or fun facts, as I like to call them. And so one of the tasks in approaching this report was to limit the amount of segues and tangents. But you will notice from looking at the drafts that we've put a lot in the footnotes because it really is a lot to talk about. And in our efforts to structure everything as sort of a central and readable narrative that ideally can be read in the course of an afternoon and then discussed afterwards, we did try to limit ourselves. But this is also, as we said, very much a work in progress. So our center's approach, of course, is to look at China's relations with Europe from a sort of a long-term perspective and to think about the many different directions and permutations that this could go into. But we took a generalist approach to this report, not a specialist approach. And we tried to be as inclusive as we could. So we really tried to give airtime to all the Nordic countries. We skew a little bit towards focusing on Sweden because we are based in Sweden and we draw a lot on Swedish material and Swedish experiences. But of course, we really tried to be fair to both the Chinese side and the different Nordic countries, while also stressing that there is a lot of overlap. It really, really is very difficult to tease things apart. So we tried to figure out what patterns would be interesting to our readers and what we could sort of tease apart in the report. And in the forthcoming report, we'll also try to re-emphasize those areas. And I'm going to touch upon them a little bit today, but I don't want to take too much away from my co-discussants or from the report itself, because I do hope that as many people as possible will read the report and this will stimulate thinking and discussions about what is a very sort of special subset in the field of international relations. Right, okay. And in our collaborative approach, there's been a lot of deleting and copy pasting and cutting. So to be completely honest with our audience, I'm not even sure what's made the cut and what hasn't, or what will make the cut and what hasn't in the final report. But I'm going to sort of try to run through the history of Sino-Nordic relations as it is now, or as we've seen it in this report. But I want to add the very strong caveat that we may add more material or we may take some away from the discussion. So what I say today might not quite accurately reflect the report in its final form. Okay, so anyone who has been at a Chinese diplomatic event in the Nordic countries or in Stockholm or basically anywhere in the world will likely have noticed this tendency in diplomatic rhetoric to focus on the longevity of the relations between China as a country and whatever partner country. In fact, you don't need to be invited to a sort of closed-door diplomatic event to see this. You can go onto Wikipedia pages or any other area where you have a discussion about China's bilateral relations. There always will be a preamble about some special aspect of the relationship and how far back it goes. And when engaging with a country like China and its political and diplomatic history, of course, you're dealing with an entity that is that has existed for a very long time and sort of prides itself on the antiquity of its statehood, which for us as Europeans, or particularly as North Americans, can be a little bit daunting, right? Rather than looking back at 200 or 300 or 150 years of history, you're looking back at 1,000 years of history or 3,000 years of history, depending on what kind of rhetoric you see. But so we wanted to investigate a little bit this idea about Sweden being celebrated as one of the first countries, first not communist countries, the first Western countries to have a diplomatic relationship with the People's Republic of China, because this is something that you hear in diplomatic rhetoric. We are so happy to have this sort of long-standing relationship. And so my colleagues and I thought, well, let's look a little bit at the context in which this developed and what were some of the push and pull factors. And so you run across all these great little anecdotes and these small sort of technically correct isms, which can be greatly enjoyable as a researcher, but they also provide a point of departure for more discussion. So when looking at the diplomatic history of Sweden and China back in 1949 and 1950, it becomes clear that the Swedish and much of the Nordic diplomatic establishment was already present in China. There already was an existing relationship, both in terms of both an economic relationship and a political relationship and what you could call a people-to-people relationship, particularly missionaries and travelers and characters like Sven Hedin, who were operating as archaeologists and traveling through China, sort of contributed to this relationship, how people in the Nordics perceive China and how people in China perceive the Nordics. Of course, there is a little bit of a difference in scale between China and the Nordic countries. That's also something that bears keeping in mind. But at the time of the founding of the People's Republic of China in October 1949, most Nordic countries that had a presence in China were content to follow very closely the dictates of British policy and diplomacy. And there are some reasons for this. There was sort of a close association between the trading companies that were set up, particularly in Sweden and Denmark and the UK, as well as with, and of course, Norway was there as well. Iceland had just become independent, so we don't have that much about Iceland in this period. But maybe some specialized writing will sort of find more about the early roots of Sino-Icelandic relations. But what's very important in this beginning of diplomatic relations is that this is a negotiated process in which states are negotiating with each other over things like access. And so one of these sort of technically correctisms that you find is that the British government extended diplomatic recognition to the People's Republic of China as the legal government of China earlier than Sweden or Denmark or Finland, but that this really sort of fired the starting gun. At the time, the Chinese Communist authorities didn't recognize Britain's recognition, if that makes sense. They didn't respond. They didn't embrace this recognition, and there's a reason for this. There was still a lot to negotiate, right? Hong Kong remained under the control of the British government, and this was something that Beijing certainly was seeking to contest. Whereas a country like Sweden didn't have similar consideration. It was no part of what was viewed as Chinese patrimony that was owned by the Swedish crown. And throughout all of this, trade and access to markets played an important role, and kind of an echo of what we have today, right? We're still talking about trade. We're still talking about access, and we're still talking about added value through trade. And then you begin to see these periods in the history of the new China, the People's Republic of China, where you have periods of sort of trying to reach out to the world, and then you have periods of disruption. So a very early period of disruption was the Korean War, which in effect would go on to cement this relationship where the Republic of China would continue to enjoy some form of international support on Taiwan. And of course, it created a situation in which the PRC was in effect fighting a war with the United States in Korea and with the United Nations. Very importantly, the United States is involved in the Korean War with a United Nations mandate, which is a little bit awkward considering, or not awkward, but this might have made things difficult for Beijing, who at the time were seeking to gain a seat in the United Nations. So going to war with the United Nations made that a little bit difficult. Yes, I think that is maybe all that we can say in the time that we have. But then as you run through the story of modern Chinese history, you come across a lot of episodes that had a major impact on relations with the Nordic countries, and that sort of follows a red thread throughout that period of modern history. So after the Korean War, there was a relatively quick effort by the Nordic states to jumpstart trade again. This is sort of an aberration, and now there is the possibility for trade again. And so you begin to have these trade agreements between Sweden and China, between Finland came first, between Finland and China, Sweden and China, Norway and China. And when you look at those documents, it's also very clear, you begin to see a very clear logic, which is that the Chinese side will provide agricultural produce, right? Animal byproducts, grain. I think the Swedish trade document actually mentions bamboo products and this type of thing in exchange for specialized components that you need for industry, particularly things like electrical components and this type of thing. And this begins to set the stage, or this is part of the larger pattern that's happening in China of the preparation for the second 5-year plan. The whole process of which is a story unto itself, but would basically lead to the so-called Great Leap Forward, this effort to forcibly modernize China that broke a little bit with Soviet or socialist Eastern Bloc doctrine. But so you can really see it. The idea is to finance the industrialization of China through by harnessing agricultural produce, right? And that produce is then supposed to be sold to countries outside of China, including countries like Sweden and Finland and Norway. And this would ultimately, the management of the economy in this period would create conditions that were very destructive for a lot of Chinese people. It led directly to a famine, and and a lot of human suffering. We don't need to get too much into detail about that, but I feel it's important to mention that there is this Sino-Nordic dimension to these sort of developments in Chinese history. And then you have the Great Leap Forward during, the Cultural Revolution soon afterwards, after the Great Leap Forward, which also impacts relations. It makes it much more difficult to have organized diplomatic relations when all of the senior diplomatic staff of the PRC are being withdrawn, when Nordic citizens are being attacked in the streets of Beijing, when you have these things like an incident with Jan Sigurdsson, who's attacked in a Swedish diplomatic car by a group of Red Guards. This makes things much more difficult. But the desire to jumpstart relations, I think, seems to be pretty deeply ingrained in the thinking of Chinese leaders. So as soon as, and in part this is because the Nordic countries are less objectionable. Again, right? Here's this pattern again. There is this idea about Nordic social democracy, which, if not the same as Chinese communism, but don't get me wrong, I do not at all mean to associate the two, but there is perhaps a recognizable impulse that both sides can sort of draw on in this, that makes it politically more acceptable to both sides. In the absence of major disputes like between China and the Soviet Union at this point, real world disputes over border regimes is really becoming, and as well as ideology, right, is becoming a problem for China and its foreign relations. I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic. I will try to stick to my allocated time. But so after this period of turbulence, you have a real enthusiasm, you have a real return to China in the 70s. You have delegation visit after delegation visit. When you look at the protocols of Chinese diplomatic history that are put out by the foreign ministry and all these very large tomes, you can just see 6 months after 6 months, there's constantly some kind of Nordic delegation in Beijing meeting with senior people. And there are also senior Chinese leaders like Zhao Ziyang visiting countries like Sweden and Norway. So this is sort of an important part of relations. And then you have the period of the 1980s where you have the Dengist reforms and the opening up of China and the foundations of a Chinese economic system as we see it today, which, and as well as political turbulence, right, which will lead to the 1986 campaign against bourgeois liberalization, and then the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests and the ensuing crackdown, which again would suspend relations with China. This is perhaps the most recent episode of sort of an international response to China, but that also didn't last very long, particularly through the course of the 1990s, as there was this growing awareness that China was not going to return to some kind of hardline neo-Maoist situation. And perhaps in a sort of an irony of history, the retrocession of Hong Kong helped in this, right? The idea that Beijing was willing to tolerate a one country, two systems. So, I mean, it's also a very complicated process. So when I talk about these different episodes of Chinese history, I'm not saying that this is exclusively germane to Chinese diplomacy or Chinese foreign policy, but it certainly plays a role. And you also have leaders like Jiang Zemin who are saying on, in Western television programs, oh, we want democracy, we want our political system to change. we just need time, and we have our sort of Chinese approach to this. And this is also sort of a recurrent theme that goes on throughout Chinese history. When it becomes clear that there isn't going to be a return to this sort of Maoist excess, there is a sort of a process by which people from the Nordic industry and in the outside world are sort of reassured that the clock isn't necessarily going to turn back in China. And this will then eventually lead into an effort by the Chinese state. Sometimes we refer to it as a party state, right? Because the Communist Party is so influential in the machinery and the architecture of state, launching things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which brings with it sort of a lot of question marks. Like, what is the intention here? What is going on? How do we as international partners fit into this? How do the Nordic states fit into the Belt and Road Initiative, and how do they basically respond to Chinese bilateral Chinese bilateral initiatives? How do they how is the Chinese side going to respond to things that are happening in the Nordic countries? Things like awarding a Nobel Peace Prize to a dissident leader. How will that impact state-to-state relations, and how do we sort of move forward from that? But I think Viking is going to talk a little bit about the relationship between China and Sweden, and the sort of the rationale behind Chinese, Beijing's approach to the Nordic countries. And I think David is also going to talk a little bit about Germany's relationship with China and how that kind of refracts in this larger European approach. But of course, I will be happy to discuss any of these points going on. But I think that's my 20 minutes gone. But I'll still be here. So I think I will return the floor to you, Torbjörn.
Thank you very much, Julian, for your very lucid and very concise, I think, presentation. It's now my pleasure to turn to David Merkle. I should tell you all that David is desk officer on China at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. He has degrees in East Asian studies with a focus on China and Taiwan, both from the University of Bochum and the University of Tübingen. He spent 2 years in Taiwan, where he was an exchange student at National Zhongxing University in Taichung. And prior to his current position, he was project assistant at the Shanghai office of the Adenauer Stiftung. And he has also worked for the Bank of China in Frankfurt am Main. So David is a scholar official with rich background. The floor is yours, David, please.
Thank you very much, Torbjörn, and thanks, of course, also Gabriele Baumann and the colleagues at KAS and ISDP for this opportunity also to be part of this discussion today, and especially thankful to Julian and Viking also to be part of it, and especially for this great insights into the long history of the relations between the Nordic countries and China. I just think a little how I could maybe start my remarks, because I as we will, of course, later also discuss Viking's remarks with the focus on Sweden, as you mentioned, Julian. Maybe I would first try to be just a little short, and maybe I could afterwards talk a little bit about like the German perspective, just to not bring the two presentations of you, or to make a too long a cut between them. But maybe just from my side, some short remarks, because when I worked for the Adenauer Foundation in Shanghai, which was in the years 2013 to 2016, it was impressive how China actually, at least especially also in the civil society actors, journalists, really developed great interest in the environmental policies of the Nordic countries. So we had a cooperation partner in Shanghai, a business ecology, environmental magazine, journalists by training, but also doing a lot of awareness work to really increase public discussions on environmental topics in China. And we usually cooperated with the Nordic embassies or the general consulates based in Shanghai, and designers from the Nordic countries. And so for me, this was very impressive, because what you mentioned in the beginning, Torbjörn, that there's a lot to learn from the German experiences in the relations with China. I think as a German and as somebody from the Western EU, countries, I would say we much more have to broaden our horizon and use exactly these opportunities like today to learn about your discussions, about your impressions, also the experiences and the relations with China, and especially as we also will come to discuss later some of the more current and very urgent topics, how to really bring together our approaches, our policy approaches, that we as Germans actually also need to develop this much more geopolitical perspective and view. So I would say maybe just in a few words, our lessons right now, maybe you hear it like Sunday, on Sunday, officially, the term of Chancellor Merkel came to an end in Germany, who was for 16 years probably one of the international politicians who was visiting China. I think it was even 17 times. So in average, at least once a year. Then Germany developed also a strategic dialogue with all cabinet members of the government with the Chinese side. So there was a very strategic approach also towards China. But, and this has to be emphasized, we were in the last years very much focusing on our bilateral relations with China. And as Julian, you also pointed out in your report, there are really differences between the approaches of the Nordic countries. There were different times when diplomatic relations were established with China. Of course, also some core issues arising from, for example, the Nobel Prize award given to Liu Xiaobo and in previous times to the Dalai Lama. And we had similar experiences also in Germany, especially in the very first year when Angela Merkel also received the Dalai Lama. But then in the end turned to a more, if you want, pragmatic approach towards China to really build a relationship on trust. And I think this is something that we can see in many of our cases also, which you introduced and are going probably to speak a bit more later about the Swedish experiences, that there is this, there are these different waves in our relations. And this is something, for example, we as Adenauer Foundation with 2 offices in China can also experience, because we have scholarship holders. So we have a lot of former scholarship holders, Chinese, who came to Germany with a scholarship of our foundation, studied here, went back to China, often also working in the German-Chinese relations at a certain point. Many of them are scholars and academics. And if you speak with the different generations and also their, let's say, their prospect or their outlook on how the relations are developing, there's always this kind of a confidence that at one point there will be also a fruitful basis and fundament to come together again closer, in spite of all the really tremendous developments, especially we saw since Xi Jinping took over the leadership in 2012, 2013. So I would say this is something which we, of course, as biggest economy within the European Union, as Germany, also have to do a lot of strategic thinking about. We have to bring together our different, let's say, our complementary skills and experiences, and to really, come together as with an European approach. Maybe I will speak a little bit more later, but maybe that just as some first remarks. Thank you very much. I think you have to unmute.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, David, for these incisive comments that invites discussion. But I think I will refrain from that for the moment and turn to Mr. Viking Boman. Viking is an analyst at the Swedish National China Center. He comes from a background at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in Stockholm, and he has worked also for our embassy in Beijing, which, by the way, is the neighbor of the German embassy, as you know. I was myself posted in Beijing for 3 years and almost daily and was in contact almost daily with German colleagues. Viking holds a double Master of Science degree in International Affairs from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and also from Peking University. Viking, it's very nice that you want to be with us today. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Torbjörn, and thank you for the invite and the possibility to read this excellent report, Julian. I think the points you make about recent developments in diplomatic relations are really interesting, and I thought I'd add a few points here by elaborating on public opinion in the Nordics and how I think this plays into Sino-Nordic relations more broadly. And I'll do this in 3 points. First, I'll just briefly go over basically China's strategic interests in the Nordics, and I break this down into 4 components. And second, I'll argue that one of these components, the way China pursues its core interests, promotes its core interests in the region, is having an adverse effect on public opinion, and that this in turn limits China's ability to reach its strategic goals over the long term. And third, if there's time, I'll raise some possible reasons for why China continues to do this, despite it seemingly being quite counterproductive. And I should say that I'll take a Swedish centric approach here, but I'm happy to discuss the extent to which these points are valid also in the other Nordic countries. So what are China's strategic interests in the Nordic? First, the promotion of core interests then, and you'll know probably what this means, but essentially this is about shielding, proactively fending off and confronting any criticism of its policies in Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, Hong Kong. China sees these issues as issues of territorial integrity, national sovereignty, and views any interference here as unacceptable. The second component is to use the Nordic countries to gain influence or access in other fora, such as the European Union or the Arctic Council, for example. And this is pretty straightforward. A close relationship with a Nordic state can give China more information from the inside of the EU, or it can lobby a Nordic state to promote a specific policy in the EU, for example. Third strategic interest would be China using the Nordics to acquire technology and know-how. So specific industries will vary between Nordic countries, but I think it's clear that there's a significant innovation capabilities and technology in the Nordic markets that can be beneficial to China for both civilian and military purposes, including areas such as semiconductors and dual-use technology. Fourth is promoting a positive public opinion of China in the Nordics. And I think this is a key element, as it may actually be seen as a prerequisite for long-term success in all of the other areas. For example, it would be harder for China to gain access to technology if there is a widespread skepticism towards Chinese investments. But I'll elaborate on this in a second. So moving on to the second point I'd like to make, I think that the way China is promoting its core values in recent years is having an adverse effect on public opinion. And in the Swedish case, you can see this very clearly in the last 3 years, where the embassy has proactively confronted actors on basically all levels of Swedish society who have spoken out against China's policy. So they're accusing Swedish actors who speak of Hong Kong and Xinjiang of being misguided or as even promoting an anti-China agenda. And after 3 years, it's quite clear that this has not been successful. It's not improved the image of China or reduced the criticism. The embassy's actions have in fact been met with extensive negative reactions, and it seems to have reinforced the view that China may be a threat to Swedish interests across the board. So, and also importantly, there are several surveys that show that Swedes are now probably the most negatively predisposed population in Europe towards China. So how may these increasingly negative views of China be affecting the ability of China to pursue its strategic interest in the Nordic. And I think over the long term, it's going to make it really hard for China. If you look at the first interest, for example, the promotion of core interests, China is attempting to silence any criticism of its human rights records, its policies in Hong Kong, Taiwan. And this confrontational approach has, it may lead to some self-censorship, but even over the short term, it seems that it has sparked more counter reactions than led to silence. And over the long term, this is unlikely to buy China more support for its positions, I think. Second, strategic interest, using the Nordic to gain access to the EU, for example, and clearly negative public opinion here is not going to help. Why would policymakers and civil servants grant access to representatives from a country that's generally viewed as a potential threat to Swedish interests? Third component, China wants to gain access to the Nordic markets, technology and know-how, and in a climate of negative public opinion, this is probably going to be harder. There are numbers that show that in the Nordic countries, there is decreasing approval ratings for Chinese investments. So on a macro level, this may have an impact by leading to stronger investment screening, as we have seen. On a micro level, individual business people can become more skeptical towards dealing with Chinese investments in general. So overall, I think that the way that China is promoting its core values in the Nordics is likely to be counterproductive over the long term. And just the last point here, if I have a couple of more minutes, why is China doing this? Why is it continuing doing this if it's counterproductive? And I see two main possibilities here. The first one is that if we assume that China is a rational actor, it has all the information that we do. So basically, Chinese policymakers, they sat down at a table and they said, look, we're aware of the long-term consequences here of our actions in the Nordics. It's not good, but we want to do it anyway. So in this understanding, maybe acquiring Nordic technology or using a Nordic country to gain access to the EU isn't actually that important. Maybe China has other ways to do that. Instead, they think it's more important to use a Nordic country like Sweden to send a signal to others about the potential costs of opposing China by issuing threats, sanctioning individuals, etc. And maybe they hope that this type of intimidation tactic will be more effective over the long term, leading to self-censorship, etc., etc. Now, another possibility, which actually might be more likely, is that Chinese policymakers aren't that interested in the consequences of its actions in the Nordics. So the ambassador in Sweden was recently interviewed, and when asked what he thought about the surveys showing negative public opinion trends, he wasn't really interested. He said, this is either US propaganda or misguided research. I've spoken to Swedes, and I think they actually like Sweden. So that's one part. The other reason to believe this is that the Chinese MFA is also pursuing a very similar broad-based wolf warrior diplomacy, and it doesn't really seem to be interested in the long-term consequences this is having on global public opinion. So in this understanding would suggest that what is shaping China's actions in the Nordics is not actually primarily an analysis of the effects of different courses of actions, but something else. Maybe directions stemming from the domestic arena. We don't know. But regardless of which of these explanations are more accurate, I think the main conclusion is still that China's promotion of its core interests is increasingly taking precedence over the pursuits of its other interests in the Nordics. China promoting its core interests is not something new, but it seems to me that it's increasingly overshadowing other parts of the relationship. I'll be happy to discuss this further, but I think I might have spoken for too long already.
Not at all too long, Viking. This was extremely interesting. I think I will now turn to Julian and give you the chance to respond if you wish. Would you like to say something at this stage?
Sure. Well, I can try to take up the point of public opinion and maybe sort of ask David a little bit about this, because my understanding is that in Germany, based on the most recent sort of Pew Research polls, there's an increasing, I guess there's a similar trend as in Sweden. There's an increasingly negative response to developments in China. And it seems to me a little bit that this stems from several sort of developments happening within China at once, right? You have, on the one hand, you have this the heavy-handed approach to demonstrators in Hong Kong, which is very visible in the Nordics, right? We're very sort of plugged in to that development. Of course, there's also the treatment of ethnic minorities in Western China, in Xinjiang, and also in Tibet. Tibet has long sort of occupied sort of a key position in Western discussions about human rights in China. And also in Xinjiang, right, where you have this, what's been called a cultural genocide, or which some have gone so far as to label an actual, or not the cultural, that some have gone so far as to label a full-scale genocide. So I was wondering if you could say anything about German public opinion, sort of reacting to that, or if there are other causes and drivers as well. If the Chinese diplomatic establishment in Germany has also pursued similar wolf warrior approach.
Yes, thank you, Julian. I think before I give the word to David, I would also like to raise a question then for Viking rather. I think your comments about China's policy vis-a-vis Sweden were extremely interesting, and I agree with you on most points. But I would like to add one dimension, and that is that in trying to understand Chinese behavior, not least in the international arena, we must not forget that China is not monolithic. China is not a monolith. Personally, I'm pretty convinced that the wolf warrior diplomacy is indeed very controversial in many circles in China, and that this kind of policy reflects more or less successfully the ideas of the present paramount leader. Although I'm not even sure that he himself is altogether happy with it. No, but my point is to say, and this is also a question for Viking, isn't it very likely that the kind of treatment that China has given Sweden during the past few years is indeed very controversial? And I wonder what your thoughts are about the change of ambassadors in Stockholm in this case. That, of course, Mr. Gui had been here for 4 years, I think, so it's not unnatural that he has been recalled back to Beijing. But this could also mark the beginning of some kind of reorientation of China's policy vis-a-vis Sweden. My prediction is that people in Beijing are aware that wolf warrior diplomacy has not been very successful, and certainly not in Sweden, and that it is quite likely that we will soon hear overtures for more cooperation and mutual understanding again. Let me say, against the background of that I've been watching China really since the late 1960s. And if we think of the harsh language that China, not only Ambassador Gui, but also the spokespersons for the foreign ministry in Beijing have used during the past few years, this is nothing in the history of Swedish-China relations before can be compared to this. I was around during the Cultural Revolution, and although Julian referred in passing to the incident when a Swedish diplomat was apprehended in Beijing and even beaten, I think. And of course, this was very bad for Sino-Swedish relations. And in the aftermath of the June 4th crackdown in 1989 and the early 90s, the relations between China and Sweden were really at a low ebb. But during both these periods of time, the language-wise, discourse-wise, Sweden used much harsher language vis-a-vis China than the Chinese authorities used vis-a-vis us. So something what has taken place during the past few years really marks a dramatic change. And I would think that it is very likely that the leaders in Beijing are also learning something from this, but I don't know. So I also raised this question. But first, David, please, would you like to comment on Julian's question?
Yeah, thanks very much. And also, of course, for this little excurse also in the history, actually, also how this diplomatic relations always were connotated and what kind of discourses also took place. Because this is, of course, very important to also keep in mind, like what role actually we as transmitters, if you want, between two sides, two cultures, two societies also play. So especially also in the field of China studies. But absolutely, I would agree that we have the same discourse now on China, because China is, as Viking really described, very systematically, of course, trying to get discourse power to really intimidate people with different opinions who question the Chinese narratives we see, and this always has this strong political dimension. Then this is what we see. So we have, for example, also we had Mesut Özil, one of the German soccer players, who did some public statement about the situation of the Uyghurs, and he was totally banned. Like there's no, he's not even appearing anymore in the online soccer games and so on. So we have similar experiences, what you also described today. And I think for the German discussion, it's also very essential. If you look back at 2019, it was actually the German Federation of Industries who presented a key paper on China, a strategic paper in which the German industries for the very first time also used the term strategic rival, China as a competitor, not only as partner, as we used to do for quite a long time. And this actually was also the framework for the discussions afterwards that started in Brussels, especially driven by the European Parliament, who, and in the end also with the strategic outlook published by the European Commission, that we have this very new, let's say, a conceptualization of the Chinese Communist Party as a leadership in China that in all areas is trying really to put also their own thinking, their own strategic thinking at the forefront, and that it's not like that you can just reduce the perspective on China on a bilateral level and try to just keep the relations in a very smooth and dynamic manner. It is much more that we have to use a global perspective on China, and we see how much impact they already have in continents like Africa and Latin America, where you don't have any public discourses yet on China. And this is used as a kind of strategic leverage to increase their footprint, and in the end also to change the standards we used to agree on. And so this whole approach of China's global outreach, together with what was mentioned, is this really strategic intention to be in the forefront of public discourses and to don't accept any different opinions. This is something that, of course, in our public already has become, or that we became aware of, and in the end also takes or plays a bigger role now in our also strategic thinking towards China. And I think this is something where we, as European countries, really have to develop a much more communication channels, where we have to exchange also these experiences, have to coordinate also in a much more vivid way. And you mentioned, Robin, China is not monolithic. That's true. That's what we shouldn't forget, because China, right now, the government in Beijing plays this game also quite well, to say all criticism towards China is a kind of, behind that is a is the anti-China agenda driven by the United States. And this is, of course, something we cannot accept, because many of us working on China, who stayed in China, have really close relationships to many Chinese friends, and of course also partners, cooperation partners, as we also do it as a foundation. That is something where we really have to find much better communication strategies, also to show that this is not an anti-China agenda. This is discussions we would have on our own actors as well. And we are very critical right now, especially on our economic actors who maybe publicly are not, do not dare also to speak quite frank, or don't or shy away of discussions also on China. So that's actually a standard we have developed, and that of course also has to play an important role in our relations towards China.
Thank you very much, David. Now, before opening up for more general discussion, we already have 2 written questions. I give the floor to Viking, please.
Thank you, Torbjörn. And I completely agree on the point that about China not being monolithic. I think it's important here, and I'm also convinced that wolf warrior diplomacy is quite controversial in China. But there seems to be quite, in Europe at least, with this wolf warrior trend, there seems to be this dominant way of interpreting guidelines from Xi Jinping, that this is the way we're supposed to do it, right? But on the question of the new ambassador to Sweden and how this might change relations, I think it'd be useful then to see how the current ambassador may be special compared to other ambassadors. And there's one argument saying, look, he's not special. He's just like the other wolf warrior diplomats in other parts of Europe. So we're unlikely to see any change. And I think it's probably true to some extent that the politics are not going to change, right? But the current ambassador may be special in some ways. For one, he was a very early wolf warrior diplomacy, so he positioned the Swedish embassy as sort of a front runner here, so that's one point. And the second point is that he seems to have been particularly harsh, or using particularly harsh rhetoric, and his argumentation seems to be, sorry, you froze. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
We can hear you.
I'll continue then. You're frozen, but I'll continue going. So that's one bit. So he seems to be very personally engaged in this wolf warrior diplomacy, and that might have something to do with him not having a lot of experience from democratic countries. He has a background from the Soviet Union, etc. So I think this could indicate that whoever comes afterwards, if this is a person that has more experience from democratic countries, it might make it a little bit easier to communicate, even if the wolf warrior components of China's diplomacy may not go away. Thank you.
Thank you very much for, to my ears at least, very wise words. We still have 30 minutes to go of this interesting webinar, and I think that I will now turn to the questions that have been handed in, and I also encourage attendees to give us more questions. The first question comes from Mr. Ulf Sandmark, who writes as follows: most important for the Nordic countries and also for Germany is the opening overland to China beside the historic maritime connection with the Belt and Road. Especially as the Nordic position on the Great Circle is the closest of all of Europe. How do you see possibility of developing this shortcut into an international industrial development corridor along the Nordic triangle, Helsinki, Stockholm, Oslo, and Copenhagen, Hamburg, including building the fixed connection between Sweden and Finland via Åland? Who would like to say something about this?
Well, it's a complicated question, but I can give it a try. We are writing part of our report will cover the Arctic as a separate entity, although it'll echo a lot of the discussion about Sino-Nordic relations and other parts of the report. But so I think one of the points that's being made here is there is this idea of a sort of maritime shortcut that goes through the North Pole or goes through the Arctic Sea to connect Northern Europe with China, right? And this is projected to cut down on shipping costs and time by about a third. And this is, of course, predicated on the environmental changes taking place in the Arctic, which say that possibly by 2030, the polar sea will be fully navigable. And there is certainly an interest to develop that possibility, although at least from where I'm sitting, it seems like there's still a lot of question marks about how or when this will become operational and how operational it will be. Concerning a fixed connection between Sweden and Finland, I don't know very much about that. Certainly there is an impetus to create more or to tap into existing infrastructure projects that are cross-border. So there has been a lot of interest in Kirkenes in northern Norway to connect that with existing infrastructure corridors in Norway, Sweden, and Finland. How viable those are at the moment, I'm not prepared to say, but certainly there is a consideration there. It is sort of part of a developing discussion. So hopefully that sort of at least touches upon an answer. As I see, we've just lost Viking. But I'm happy to discuss further, or I can direct you to our Arctic-focused webinar I think in 3 weeks' time, where we'll talk about this maybe a little bit more. Yeah.
I think that's a good suggestion, Julian. The second question here has been raised by Mr. Janne Hakko. China, he writes as follows: China has recently been investing in infrastructure in Europe, ports, networks, etc., also in the north. Could China use its investments and possessions to coerce, especially smaller nations, to its will? And how likely might this scenario be? David, would you like to say something about this?
Yeah, yeah, thank you very much. So what we, for example, also do is to look at countries in Southeast Asia, also in Latin America, on their dependencies on China and their bilateral trade relations. And what we also found is that in many cases, infrastructure projects are exactly also by the agreements they conduct have a very powerful leverage actually for the Chinese funding side. And as you know, the Chinese bank system is almost entirely in the hands of state-owned banks, at least the traditional banking. Of course, there's a lot of fintech activities and a lot of very innovative initiatives going on, but there's also a kind of a policy shift right now in China in terms of financial and economic policies. So that's what we see, that we have really this traditional state-owned lenders in China. One of them I also worked for a short while in Frankfurt, and this is exactly what we can see. That of course everything is based on an agreement. So this means the countries, the stakeholders of the target country, they basically agreed to this kind of contract. So it's not something they should be surprised of in the late end. But Belt and Road Initiative has this huge, let's say, PR problems right now, because there are, we know, a lot of cases. And within Europe, we know, of course, Piraeus as one of the examples, the port. We see now, I think China right to this moment has a global port activities with more than 98 cases, or around 98 cases, which means they either are a stakeholder of a total port investments, or they bought in certain terminal infrastructure of ports. What they, for example, right now also are about to conclude a contract with the Hamburg Hafen, with the Hamburg port. So I think that we really have to be aware that this kind of critical infrastructure and ports and a lot of infrastructure activities are critical for the solid financial foundation also of many countries, and there needs to be much more clever ways how to cope with that. So, for example, the European Union is now also introducing public procurement a mechanism also to make it possible for local companies actually to have a better stake, because there was a lot of dumping cases in the past that actors from third countries would have in the end advantages because they have state subsidies in the back and can provide contracts to a level that would from a first side be very attractive to the countries who want to, or to the stakeholders who want to conduct those projects. So I think there are some mechanisms on the way right now, and that's where also our public discourse also has to continue about.
Torbjørn, I think you may be muted.
I'm so sorry. I get automatically muted. Anyone else who would like to comment on this? If not, I just discovered that we have a question in our chat also from a person called Koki. He or she writes as follows: what do Nordic countries think about Indo-Pacific? I'm not sure that I understand this completely. The person who raises this question is called Koki Shigenoi. Could you have a try, Julian? What do Nordic countries think about Indo-Pacific?
I had a feeling you were going to ask me, Torbjørn. Well, it's very difficult for me to speak sort of on behalf of the Nordic countries about the Indo-Pacific concept. Certainly, there are a lot of question marks about how security will develop in the Indo-Pacific. I think there is a desire on the part of many Nordic states for a predictability in international affairs and for sort of, how do you say it, like a consistency, particularly when it comes to the South China Sea. I would be curious if Viking has anything to say about the Nordic approach to the Indo-Pacific. Certainly, Germany has an Indo-Pacific strategy paper that particularly highlights cooperation with existing regional frameworks, including the things like the Pacific Islands Forum, which is pretty far off in the South Pacific. So it spans a large geographic region. So it's very difficult to put your finger exactly on what different attitudes about the Indo-Pacific are. But Viking, did you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, from what I've seen, and I haven't read any documents on the Indo-Pacific from any Nordic country, but from what I know, none of the Nordic countries have a strategy for the Indo-Pacific as Germany or France, for example. So maybe and you know, that may be logical for smaller countries geographically very far away to not prioritize this issue. But if I were to guess, I suppose we would be many Nordic countries would be quite close to the German position.
Thank you. Then we have a question from Mr. Alexander Ibsen, who writes as follows: we have read a lot of French reactions to AUKUS, but less of the Chinese reactions. Considering the close partnership between UK and the Nordic countries, does AUKUS have the potential to influence Sino-Nordic relations? Thanks, from Alex Ibsen in Norway. Who would like to take up this issue?
I think Viking was raising his hand. Yeah.
Yeah, I can jump in to speculate a bit. I mean, depends on the long-term effects of AUKUS in general, I suppose. But if, as it appears, it will strengthen French calls for strategic autonomy, etc., in the European Union, and to act independently from the US. That might put more pressure on the Nordic countries on this point. And Nordic countries have different relationships to the concept, right? But some like it more, some like it less. So it might push for further integration. It depends on what position you have, if you like it or not. Also, it might reinforce the divide, I guess, between the Anglo-Saxon bloc and the European Union, right? And so it might make it a little complicated for the Nordic countries, as they also like to stay close to the Anglo-Saxon sphere in security, etc.
Thank you. Personally, I very much agree with this. Yes, and then we have a question from Janne Leino. I thought we had run out of questions. He writes, thanks for presentations and for the insight. I have a broader question regarding Europe's voice regarding China on the world stage. As we know, it is difficult to form a united European response to China on the EU level. Reading your report, it becomes clear that there is also not a Nordic approach to China. Questions regarding this, : do you see that there is a need for closer cooperation between the Nordics on China on topics like 5G, forced technology transfer, countering disinformation, etc.? If yes, which format should this be discussed in? For example, the Nordic Ministry of Council of Ministers. Well, who would like to take? May I begin by saying that I think that China's present role in world affairs calls for greater cooperation among all European countries, and also for re-strengthening the partnership between North America and Europe. Of course, there is a special relationship among the Nordic countries, and we should be, and we are especially close. So I'm all for promoting that. But I think most importantly, the Europeans should first of all avoid becoming divided on China. I mean, this is the Chinese authorities are very good at playing out different countries, governments against each other, especially in offering favorable trade conditions. And I think it's very important that the Europeans should try to stick together and form a united front. It also, may I take this opportunity to say something about my very personal and subjective, I'm sure many of my Swedish friends disagree with me, but some of my perceptions of the German government's China policies. My position is that we have to take a tough stance on China in many regards. And perhaps, for instance, when it comes to technology cooperation with China that has security implications, I believe that we have perhaps been too naive. But the criticism of the very notion of engagement with China, I think, has often gone too far. I think there is no alternative to engaging China. We need to communicate with the Chinese, and I think in the long run, cooperation and exchange with China is vitally important for the whole world and for China and for the Nordic countries. Now, especially in view of the accelerating climate crisis, we need to be on speaking terms with the Chinese, but we must not jeopardize our security. And it seems to me that in this regard, although Mrs. Merkel, of course, has been, I realize, has often recently been criticized for taking too soft a position on China. And I would not commit myself to a definite view on this. I have not studied her China policy that closely. But I would say that I think that often Mrs. Merkel's voice has seemed very sensible to me. and that I very much hope for a mutually productive dialogue between Europe and the United States in this regard. I think after Trump, there should be space for strengthening cooperation between Europe and the United States, and also for developing unified view vis-a-vis China. I'm not able to define that, but I think I think the policy vis-a-vis China must include engagement as a positive notion. Confrontation cannot be the solution to our relationship with China. May I also say, and this I had meant to say for the very end, but I happen to have rather close contacts with many Chinese intellectuals and writers. And I know that Mrs. Merkel personally has enjoyed great respect, also among very critical Chinese writers and social scientists. They respect her commitment to democracy, her sensibility, her soft-spokenness, and so on. They respect her in a way that closely resembles how many people in the West respect her. And again, this is not to say that she might, if I look more closely into this, I might also end up in the conclusion that she has been too soft in some regards. But I think on the whole, she has represented sensibility in the realm of international discourse. One more question here, and please contradict me and correct me if you think I'm totally wrong. Ulf Sandmark now also writes, the West is challenging China with a series of strategic security treaties like Quad and AUKUS. We also have the global Britain policy of going east of Suez. Even use of nuclear arms are being raised by the US sources. Do you think there will be a parallel increase of psychological warfare against China from the West? Who would like to take up this? David, would you like to say something?
Yes, I can. If you want, or if you allow me, I could also address your what you just mentioned, and also the question of Janne Leino, because one of the keywords actually we should really work on is solidarity, because Janne was raising the question about should we have like more coordination, closer cooperation between the Nordics, and I think this is of course on topics with security implications like in the cyber realm, telecommunications and so on. Exactly, we need really mechanisms for knowledge sharing. We have maybe you read also the article about Lithuania's findings about a Xiaomi company that basically there are a lot of open doors actually to collect data, and exactly we need this kind of information sharing between all the European countries. But I would say in some senses, or in some cases, it makes absolutely sense that we have a regional cooperation for countries who especially are in similar situations, face similar investments by China in the same sector, as it is the case also in the Nordic countries. So I think this is something we really have to be aware of. And what maybe just two additional remarks to what you mentioned about Mrs. Merkel. I think what she did was exactly to keep a trust-based relationship, and for quite long it worked very well, especially with Prime Minister Wen Jiabao. In that time, I think there was really a very good level of dialogue between the sides. But back then we had a much more bilateral approach. We didn't have this really European thinking that we have to come up actually towards China with a common approach. I think this is something that in the last years there might have been more signals needed, especially from Berlin. Also, when we look to our eastern neighbors with the 16, 17+1 mechanism, there were a lot of doubts or questions raised from the Western side, but at the same time, we kept on with our bilateral relations with China. Every delegation from the government going to China had at least 60 to 70 business representatives signing contracts with the Chinese side. So it's really also about reflecting ourselves and in the end, really showing solidarity to those countries who are faced by severe trade embargoes, other coercive means. That's what we really need to become better with in this kind of communication. Now, sorry, the question of Sandmark, I think this is also something we also shouldn't be too shy to say that the concept now we have about China is, of course, very much deriving from China's actions themselves. So I think Quad is a response that actually the whole Indo-Pacific, especially looking to the South China Sea, looking to more activities in the maritime sphere by the Chinese Navy, that there is a clear awareness that there needs to be more cooperation. And of course, this could be also from the Chinese side, they could have the conclusion there's the alliance building mechanism now, again, a confrontational approach, but in the end, it's very much about how discourses developed in China in the last years, all those clear signals, including the wolf warrior diplomacy. There is no reason to stay relaxed and to do nothing, because we have clear signs of what China's intentions are about, and so we need this kind of responses and to be prepared, and especially when we talk about Taiwan and those scenarios which are already on the table about for potential possible invasion. I mean, it's really about to raise the costs as high as possible to prevent any of those unilateral activities by the PLA. And so I think that's also something where sometimes, of course, we have to look on ourselves, look what we can do better also in terms of communications and making the right signals at the right time as well. But for some things, we also have to clearly say that those are all there are reasons in the last years, especially, why we have this security-based operations and discussions now much more than we had in the past.
Sorry, Torbjörn, I think your auto mute function is on again.
Oh, yes, I tried to unmute myself, but no, I'm unmuted. We have no questions, so maybe I can allow myself to make a couple of more comments. I very strongly sympathize with what David just said. And as for Taiwan, I also think that the time may now have come to begin a cautious discussion of the notion of one China, that there can be only one China. If we read how the leadership in Beijing defines their one China policy, this definition has an obvious Orwellian ring to it. Just a couple of days ago, I read a statement from the Global Times criticizing some people who had questioned the one China policy as defined by Beijing. And the basic argument of the people of the Global Times was to say that the one China policy principle is universally accepted. But how can it, if it is universally accepted, why do they have to criticize someone who questions this? This is Orwellian newspeak. And I mean, what we should not shy away from recognizing, I think, is that the one China principle as defined in Beijing, that was defined in an entirely or in a very different historical context, when everybody in Taiwan and in mainland China was agreed that there is only one China. The question was only who represents this China. Now we have two distinct polities, one in Beijing and one in Taipei. And of course, this means that the basis for discussing this question has changed. And I think we, as Europeans and as Westerners or as human beings, as intellectuals, we must allow ourselves to discuss this principle. The reason why it is not at all discussed is that the reactions to any discussions of it in Beijing are quite violent. I mean, if a European government would start to discuss this, the Beijing leaders would immediately threaten us with sanctions. But this cannot go on forever. And saying this does not mean that I now, here and now, commit myself to the notion of Taiwan as a separate state. This is not for me to decide. But the question, the topic, cannot remain a prohibited, a forbidden topic forever. What do you think of this, my friends?
Yeah, maybe if I just say a few words, I think this is exactly also when we discuss now, we have initiatives by Joe Biden, the Alliance of Democracies. We have a much more value-driven discourse now on how actually we also as democracies have to keep our credibility towards our own public. And as you know, and we saw it, for example, also in the German elections on Sunday, we have parts of Germany where radical parties are quite impactful. So it also means that if it comes to standing up for what we actually all work for, to keep the lifestyle we, like, not me myself, but the generations before really worked for, to have this really well-developed democratic systems, pluralism, where everybody can speak out his own opinions. This is something where we have to make a clearer link to our foreign policy discussions, because of course not everything can just be decided based on our own value system. Then we would probably even less friends in the world, but we need to come up with credibility also towards our partners, and especially towards Taiwan. It's very it's timely, or it's time now to really show also clear signs that we also can describe them as our dear value partner, where we can learn from actually a lot, especially for our own discussions about how we communicate in public, how to have new technological driven democratic debates. So I think I would totally agree with you that it's also time that we show more solidarity and also more spirit actually to work for what we always try to do also worldwide.
I'm sorry that I'm not a very good moderator. I noticed that we are really running out of time. I'm sorry, but I think we can extend our discussion for but we can extend the webinar for 5 minutes at least. But shall we round up now and let the speakers speak for a couple of minutes each, and then I would also like to give the word to Gabriele at the end. Julian, will you start?
Sure. Well, let me start off by saying thank you all very much for both of you for being discussants, and everybody who has been attending for the questions. I'm hoping my colleagues and I will be able to incorporate some of these elements into our forthcoming report. Within the confines that we have, we're already pushing the upper limit of our word and page count, but we will try. So maybe the footnotes will end up being extended a lot. That seems to be a pattern for us when we work on these things. But it's been great having you and discussing with you. And of course, the discussion goes on, right? It doesn't end here. We'll talk more. We'll have 2 more webinars in this series. And of course, in future, ISDP's Stockholm China Center will be doing all kinds of events and putting out all kinds of publications. So when we write something, we're not just writing something once, right? We're just sort of doing it over and over again as part of a longer discussion and adjusting our views. So thank you all.
Thank you, Julian, for your excellent contribution. And David, would you like to make some concluding remarks too?
Yeah, thank you really a lot for making this possible today, Julian, Torbjörn, Viking, also for your really great insights and contributions. I think I learned also a lot. Take it hopefully with me also to some circles where we continue with the discussions, and especially I'm looking forward to have many of you also here in Berlin one day, or meet at other occasions, because I think indeed these kind of discussions will be also very helpful to have face to face, to be have more time also to discuss certain views and also current issues, of course. And yeah, thank you very much also Gabriele Baumann for making this possible today in the ISDP. Thank you.
And Viking, please.
Thank you very much. I also learned a great deal today, so thank you very much. I look forward to reading the report, including all of the long footnotes.
Thank you very much. And Gabriele, would you like to say something also?
I can thank you so much, Torbjörn. I can just say a few words, try to add, but I would like to really thank you for very interesting remarks and presentation, very concise. So I'm looking forward to continuing this series of webinars, and I think that many of what we have discussed today is can be also incorporated or used also for the next discussion on people-to-people contacts and on ideologies. But because we spoke about this issue, the important issue of having also common values or a value-approached policy when it comes to China. And I think what also was made clear that the cooperation between Germany's approach to Germany and the Nordic countries when it comes to find a strategy and approach to China is more important than we might have thought of like before. So this is something we could also work on, having this report and the possibility to discuss these issues among experts. So thank you so much again.
Thank you, Gabriele. Again, thank you to you personally, and thank you, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Thank you, all panelists and all attendees. To me, today's webinar really seems much more like a beginning than an end to something. It really invites many questions to continue to discuss. And we will convene another webinar in a few weeks' time, I understand. I'm much looking forward to that. There is much to be added by us and by you. Please come back to us and tell your friends about our webinars. Thank you again, and goodbye for today.